Good morning, Greece and Rome students. Thank you guys for coming in to start chapter 10 with me today. I enjoyed hearing your responses to chapter 9, those few questions I asked you. I'd like to hear kind of what you're thinking as you learn the chapter and read the chapter. So thank you for sending those to me, and I enjoyed reading them. We do need to push on though with chapter 10. Our next test will be on chapters 9 and 10. This chapter is not quite as long as chapter 9, so we should be able to finish it up hopefully by the end of this week and then have a test sometime early next week. But I'll give you some notice on that and let you know for sure. This chapter, we're pushing ahead. We're done with the Julo-Claudian emperors, who were very influential, but Nero's dead. We had the year of the four emperors, and now we're pushing on to the next set, the next dynasty of emperors. And this particular chapter is called Military Expansion and Its Limits. So I want to start it with you guys today. Okay, let me get my way out of Vespasian here. So, of course, we already know that Vespasian was the emperor who basically won the year of the four emperors. He was the one who was the last man standing, and he became emperor in 69 AD, kind of at the very end of that year. So we call him his dynasty, him and the next two emperors, his sons, we call them the Flavian dynasty because his family name was Flavianus. So this is now the Flavian dynasty of emperors. He was from an equestrian family, the Flavian family, and they were not from a long line of people who had been senators or consuls. He and his brother were the first people from their family to reach to the level of being in the Senate. But he was known as very strong militarily. He kind of rose through skill and through military prowess. He served in Germany, Britain, and then whenever he was chosen by his men to be emperor and declared emperor, he was serving in Judea, and actually he was seeing to a Jewish revolt that had erupted there. So that's where he was whenever all this went down, and he had to quickly make his way, well, not that quickly, but he had to make his way back to Italy. So after he became emperor, remember he became emperor in December of 69. So in the year 70, not long after becoming emperor, he faces the Jewish revolt, which is still going on. He kind of had to not pay attention to it for a while he became the emperor, but he had to look towards that Jewish revolt. There was also revolts going on up in Germany of Germano-Gallic tribes, and there was also a little trouble in Rome itself with certain civil strife, because remember, the city had basically been in chaos for a year and a half with different emperors every few months and things not being tended to, probably the grain supply looking badly. So when he became emperor, it was a very tough time. He had to get things under control pretty quickly. But luckily, there was not another general out there looking to take his place, at least right away. So first thing Vespasian did was he wanted to quell the Jewish revolt that was kind of simmering in the east, and that was a big threat. So he couldn't go, but he had his son Titus stay in Judea, and Titus was his oldest son, and he was in charge of quelling the Jewish revolt. Titus ended up storming Jerusalem that year in 70 AD, and it basically destroyed large parts of the city and destroyed the large Jewish temple there in Jerusalem. So looking back in Jewish history, this would be seen as a terrible, terrible year, as you could imagine, the big temple being destroyed. But for the Romans, this would have been something to celebrate. In fact, they did celebrate it, ending this big Jewish revolt. If you've ever seen on TV people going to Israel, they go to Jerusalem and they go to the Wailing Wall, you'll see pictures of people on TV and they go to put like a little prayer and they stick it in the wall. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but you probably will sometime on the news. That's actually the base of the temple. Most of the temple was destroyed, but there was like the foundations that were still there after Rome destroyed that temple all those years ago. So it's still kind of a holy site for the Jews, even though most of that temple was destroyed. The foundation is still something people go and it's supposed to be an area of prayer and contemplation. So the Jewish revolt largely died out in 70 AD, but there were still pockets around Judea where the revolt kept going for about 3 years. So it just shows you how hard to govern and how hard to bring under control was the province of Judea. Now in Judea, after that revolt, Judea's population was decimated because they lost a lot of people trying to fight against the Romans, and also they had to put up with some severe restrictions. Some of the restrictions, Jews were barred from proselytizing for newcomers, so you could be put in prison and charged if it was found that you were, trying to bring people into the Jewish religion. Basically, Rome was probably hoping the religion would die out just by not being able to spread it. But anyways, that was the new rule. However, Jews did win something from the revolt in that they were exempt from having to participate in the imperial cult as a lot of other religions did. We talked about that last chapter. Now, there was also the Germano-Gallic revolt going on, and Vespasian crushed this in the spring of 70. Um, but he knew that this could happen again, so he had to have some kind sort of policy or some sort of way to make these things less frequent. So he instituted this policy of breaking up local auxiliaries and stationing individual soldiers in another place in the empire. This seems like just a little note, but I just want to note how crucial this is in that the Romans were getting to where, a new tribe or a new people may enter the Roman Empire and they're going to serve in the military now. And so Rome had legions that had regiments of, Gauls or Germans. That was just happening now, right? And what Vespasian realized is if we have a huge group of, let's say, some German tribe who now is with us and they're fighting for us, but if we keep them all together and they serve in an area where they grew up, at the first instance of trouble, they might still turn against us, even though they've technically become Romans. And so what he decided was we need to break those groups up, right? And we also need to station them somewhere else. So if you're a German, you might be sent to Africa or to the eastern provinces or something. And the idea was that would make them kind of more assimilate to Roman society and not feel like I'm still a Gaul, even though I'm serving with the Romans. Remember, that's what happened with the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest we talked about. You had that commander, and he had joined the Roman military, but basically when push came to shove, he went back with his German tribes. He rejoined them, and he led that very bad battle against the Romans, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. And so that was Arminius. So that was an issue. And so Vespasian was hoping to stop that by breaking these groups up and making them serve somewhere else. And this actually was very successful in making less of issues like these where you would have revolts by different people. This went on for hundreds of years successfully. And actually, one of the things, there's a lot of things you could talk about, but when we talked about Rome falling in the West, which we will later on this year, one of the reasons historians point to is that Rome wasn't powerful enough to stop these groups from serving together. They couldn't break them up anymore. They didn't have the clout to do that. And whenever they started letting these large groups of foreign soldiers kind of hang out together, it was just a problem. It was a huge problem. And I find these things interesting because, countries still struggle with this nowadays. What is the correct way to kind of assimilate people into our country? What should we make them do as far as learning our customs and language? And, how far should we go with making them kind of come into our country and act, according to our customs? Countries still kind of debate this nowadays. So anyways, that line there is kind of an important one to know. We'll talk about the breaking down of that later on this year. Also, there was advancements into Britain. Remember, Claudius was the first emperor to make an organized assault on Britain and to capture part of the island. They kept moving north in Britain and conquering more of the territory under the general called Agricola, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, and he was able to take in more of Roman territory. The Romans never conquered all of Britain, but they kept moving north, and eventually they conquered most of what we think of as England nowadays, but they never conquered up to the very top of the island, which is a little bit harder. It got colder, mountainous. There were some very fierce tribes there, so they never got into like the Highlands of Scotland in any big way. Now, within the city of Rome itself, it was in a bad shape too, because remember Nero was the emperor basically right before this. There was the year of the four emperors, but Nero was the last long-term emperor, and things in Rome had not gone well under his watch. People had grown very weary of him. We had the huge fire. Think about how many people would have been displaced and killed during that fire. So he knew that he needed to do something in Rome to give the people something to look forward to and something to kind of rally behind. So he began several building projects, the most famous of which was building this large amphitheater that would hold gladiatorial combat and whatnot to give the people something to look forward to, some entertainment. So this massive amphitheater, and eventually this will be called the Flavian Amphitheater, and the nickname nowadays we call it the Colosseum. So the Colosseum is begun in AD 70 by the Emperor Vespasian. That is one of his claims to fame. Unfortunately for Vespasian, the Colosseum took around 10 years to build, and he died before it was done. He died maybe within a year or so of it being completed. So he did not actually get to see it inaugurated with games and whatnot. But looking back on Vespasian's 10-year reign, he is considered an emperor who kind of stabilized the empire. He did a lot of good stuff. He was highly regarded by most people. He kind of calmed things after that period of 18 months of civil war, restored peace in most places of the empire, and especially compared to Nero, he seemed hardworking and fair compared to someone like Nero. Maybe not perfect, but he seemed like he was trying to do a good job and was trying to look out for the people. And in general, the position of emperor was strengthened after he had been emperor for 10 years. Now, when he dies in 79 AD, his son Titus takes over. Titus is his oldest son, so we call Titus the second of the Flavian emperors. Remember, Titus was the one who destroyed large parts of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple. And actually, what you see here, there's an arch in Rome that's still there called the Arch of Titus. And the Arch of Titus is an arch that basically commemorates, like I said, the Romans would have celebrated this, the Jews would have thought this was terrible. Basically, it celebrates this victory over the Jewish revolt. And so you actually see here, this is supposed to be a triumph of the Roman soldiers bringing back um, plunder and booty and everything back into Rome. So here you see stuff. You can actually see kind of Jewish artifacts and stuff. You see a thing looks like a menorah here. This is on the side of that Arch of Titus, which you can still see. You can see this if you visit Rome. But Titus himself, he was Vespasian's older son. He had kind of been groomed to be emperor because it was, Titus was Vespasian was an older guy, so he knew one of his sons would probably take over. And the idea now was that, you wanted a son ready to take over for you. Luckily, he had two sons. This was his oldest son, but some of the other emperors did not have sons. Like Augustus, that was a problem, right? And the Julio-Claudian emperors, a lot of them didn't have their own sons. So Titus was groomed, and it was understood he would take over for his father. Basically, everyone knew that. His reign got off to a bad start. Was a few things outside of his control. One of them was this is actually the time when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, at the very beginning of his reign. Also, there was a large fire in Rome the very next year in 80 AD. So even though these things, no one really thought obviously Vesuvius he didn't do, but no one thought he did these things. But the Romans are a bit superstitious. So there was a little thought of, is Titus somehow, is there some are the gods, I don't know, are the gods displeased with Titus being emperor, or is there some sort of bad omen here with him because all these bad things are starting to happen? But it was a rough first year of his reign. Now, on the good side, he was the emperor to open up the Colosseum. His father had started it, and he was the first one to actually run games there in the year 80th when they opened it up. And they held about 90 straight days of games for that first big one. So this would have been a very popular thing with the people. And apparently, from what we know about Titus, he loved gladiatorial competition. He loved watching this. He loved planning this, and it was one of his passions. Now, unfortunately for us, Titus might have been a good emperor and done a good job, but he eventually died of an illness pretty young. He died just barely 2 years after becoming emperor of some mysterious illness, and we're not exactly sure what that was. This just happens in the ancient world. We don't know what their thing was. So Titus dies of some sort of mysterious disease, and so someone who had never really planned to be emperor becomes emperor, and that is Titus's younger brother, called Domitian. So Domitian is the third of the Flavian emperors. He becomes emperor in 81. He was the younger son of Vespasian. He didn't have military experience, which is usually something you would expect your incoming emperors to have. And he hadn't had a lot of political positions because he was the younger son. He wasn't as expected as Titus was to become emperor. So he was kind of a surprise emperor. And we see Domitian here. You guys noticed the Medusa. That's very common on his military armor there. So Domitian definitely had some good parts to him, but there's also some negative parts we'll talk about. He wasn't as tactful with the Senate as his father and his brother had been. He held the consulship from 82 to 88, so he held it all those years in a row. And we talked about before how the Senate kind of bristles whenever you kind of suck up all these positions. That's one of the things they wanted was prominence, and they wanted to be consul, and they wanted to hold these other positions. And if you're taking them from them, that's one thing they're going to not like. He also was declared perpetual censor. That censor position, censor, was very powerful, and he was declared not just for the normal position, but perpetual censor in 84. So his Senate relationship was rocky. But one of the things that kept him emperor for so long was that he was more devoted to the army, and he gave them certain perks and respect. And so if you have the army solidly behind you, that goes for a lot, even if the Senate isn't thrilled with you. So I'll tell you some of the things why the army liked him. But by 93, just to show you how he had his, I don't know, ego or whatever had grown, he insists on being addressed by the term Dominus et Deus, which some of you who are Latin students knows that means Lord and God. So imagine, you're not the most humble guy if you eventually have people calling you Lord and God, Dominus et Deus. Also, sometimes in the Senate, he flaunted his position, and he went more into being seen as more of a complete ruler rather than just being first among equals, which is what, if you remember, Augustus said was the ideal situation. Yes, you have power, but you're not flaunting it in people's faces, and this is starting to be broken here with Domitian. He was emperor for 15 years, as you can see, though, so he was a lot longer than his brother. Some of the reasons he was able to stay emperor for that long, again, he was popular with the army. The people in general liked him, although there's some rocky things we'll talk about. And also just the fact that he was from the Flavian family gave him some credibility, and people give him a little more leeway than otherwise he might, because they remember how much respect they had for his father, Vespasian. So some things that Domitian did on the good and bad side, he extended the building programs of his father. Remember, his father had built the Colosseum, but also some other things. This was popular because people were employed by these. Now, he rose legionnaire pay by 30%. That's a pretty big pay increase. But again, this is one of the reasons the army liked him, because he respected them, but also he paid them. And this became actually kind of a tradition of when a new emperor came in, he would give the army a little raise, which is great if you're the army, and it's going to basically secure their loyalty. But think about it, if that happens too often, eventually that's going to be hard to pay for. You got to pay all those soldiers, and we talked about how there's hundreds of, 150,000 of them, and eventually more. So that's an issue. Also, he was a military man. He campaigned personally. He went with his soldiers sometimes. He wasn't just giving the orders, and not all emperors did that. Remember, Nero was very kind of hands off with the military and not as much interested in it. So the soldiers appreciated that whenever you actually were sharing in their expedition. So he campaigned across the Rhine River and also the Danube River up in the northeast. And by most accounts, he was successful with most of his military plans. Now, he's an emperor who a little bit later in his term, the first 10 years or so, pretty good, but later he becomes, and we don't know, this happens with some emperors. Maybe it's because the power gets to you, maybe just the paranoia of someone could be plotting against you, because other emperors have been killed and plotted against, right? So it's like a legitimate thing. But he becomes increasingly paranoid, especially in the last 5 years or so of his reign in the 90s, and he basically starts turning on certain senators and has some executed, and also even members of his family he turns against. So he kind of degenerates, as we would say, as an emperor Domitian. And again, we talked about people calling him Dominus et Deus. That might be showing how towards the end of his reign he's turning. So finally, he got so paranoid and turned against enough people that there's usually this tipping point where we see where the people aren't worried about bringing down a certain emperor, right? Because it seems like a better gamble than letting him remain emperor if he's this paranoid and crazy. So eventually he is assassinated in 96 AD in a conspiracy. We don't know all the details of the conspiracy, but there was strong rumors that it even might have involved his wife Domitia. So that shows you how close this may have been. And also both praetorian prefects. They had to be pretty high up to get access to the emperor to be able to kill him, right? So even though if that's not completely accurate, probably some high up people were involved in this conspiracy. So Domitian was the last of what we call the Flavian emperors, and he did not have a successor like his father had to sons to pass it on to. So remember what happened last time someone died without a successor, Nero, and how things crazy got. So we'll talk about if that happens again. So things could go badly after a death like that of Domitian. It could erupt into civil war, as happened with Nero. But luckily for Rome, that did not happen. It's kind of remarkable that it didn't happen. You might think that generals just start fighting over it, but it did not happen. And actually, after Domitian, it was a very good time for the Roman Empire. It was a very prosperous and peaceful time, and we'll talk about why that is. It didn't just magically happen. There was a reason for it, but but it's actually a good time period we're getting into. The next five emperors after Domitian, history calls the five good emperors. It's not a dynasty per se, but that's a very common way to refer. And it's a really simple meaning. It just means that all five of these emperors were mostly fair, diligent, the government worked effectively, people's lives in general were improved, and basically the system was just working. None of these five emperors were crazy or vindictive or paranoid or violent. Basically, they tried their best and did a good job. And we'll talk about why Rome lucked out and got five of those in a row also. This period of time with the five good emperors is a very famous time period, and there's one of the most famous works ever written in the English language is called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I recommend you read it sometime. It's a bit lengthy. It's 6 very large volumes, but it's written by an English historian called Edward Gibbon. He wrote this in the late 1700s, and basically it's his thoughts on why Rome fell. But like I said, it's a very, very large work, and I wish we had time to read it all, but he calls this time period, in other words, the time period of the five good emperors after Domitian, the next 80 years or so, he calls it in his book the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and most prosperous. That's a direct quote from the book. So that's an English person, an English historian looking back in the 1700s, which granted is a few hundred years ago, but it's long after Rome had fallen. And he looks back and said, this is the most happy time in humanity, was these 80 or so years when Rome had five really good emperors in a row. So just kind of remarkable to think about what we're dealing with here. Also, another thing was that the persecution of the Christians during these five emperors, none of them were Christian emperors at all, but they didn't go ahead, they didn't seek out and persecute Christians actively. Okay, so how did it happen that Rome had five good emperors in a row, right? It wasn't completely luck. There was definitely some luck involved. So who was the emperor after Domitian? Well, after Domitian's assassination, the Senate wanted to quickly be involved in choosing his successor. They didn't want there to erupt a civil war again. These things can always happen. But the first thing they did was they condemned the memory of Domitian. This is a process called damnatio memoriae, and this will happen to people later too. But basically, this means we will try to just forget about this person. And the Senate would do this especially because they hated Domitian, if you remember. But this would mean he would be removed, his name would be removed from official documents. We would try to take down any statues or monuments to him, etc. So the Senate decided that one of their senators should be the next emperor, and he was called Nerva, Marcus Culcius Nerva. We can just call him Nerva. They chose him because he was an older guy, well respected. Most people liked him. He was not controversial, and he had held high positions like the consulship. He was 66 years old when he was chosen to be emperor by the Senate. So not ancient, but also not young either. So they didn't want someone who was going to be emperor for a long, long time. So some of the things he did during his beginning of his emperorship, he focused on Italy, which had kind of been during the last bits of Domitian's reign. There was some issues in Italy, so he distributed pieces of land to the poor, which would make him kind of popular with some of the common people. He also established something that we'll see later called alimenta, which was very interesting, but it was a kind of child support payment system. Basically to help people if they would have children. It would give you certain money for having children. I don't explain exactly how it works. It was a complex thing, but it's interesting that they're beginning to do things like that. Augustus had ideas like that, and even nowadays, most countries have something that encourages you to have children and gives you tax breaks or tax credits or something for doing so. This might have led to a little increase in the birth rate in Italy, the fact that people now could get this payment system for having children. Because even now, the emperors are thinking about, we still need our birth rate to be high enough to support ourselves. So he became popular with some people, but his position was very tenuous because who would not be thrilled with him? Well, think about it. The Praetorians didn't pick him. They're the Praetorian Guard. And also the army didn't pick him. They had liked Domitian, right? Domitian had paid them a lot more. And so his death, the army is not necessarily thrilled with. So even though Nerva is popular with some people in Rome, it's hard to hold on to the emperorship very long if the army doesn't accept you. And they were a bit frustrated that they didn't get to pick the new emperor or at least have a say in it. And also, they remembered Domitian fondly. So Nerva knew he had to do something. If the army turns against him, he is dead, basically. So what he does, he takes a very radical step that he looks to a respected, well-respected, powerful Roman general, and he adopts this man, a grown man. But the idea was he's saying, okay, soldiers, I respect you. I'm going to adopt one of your own. And basically, Nerva didn't have his own son who could even have the hopes of becoming emperor. So by adopting this new man, this next man called Trajan, who again was a soldier's soldier who would be respected by the soldiers, by doing this, it was showing that I respect the soldiers, and when I die, Trajan is taking over from me because I'm adopting him. So it's a clear signal to everyone that's what he meant. Trajan at the time was the governor in Upper Germany, and it basically marked him as Nerva's successor. Nerva ends up dying in just the very next year, very early the next year, January of 98, and Trajan was ratified as princeps. And so this kind of, now the soldiers were happy with this because one of their men, someone who they knew would respect them, was there, and also Trajan, he had a good reputation in the city of Rome itself. One interesting thing here is that historians look back and say things could have gone very badly after Domitian died. There could have been another huge civil war. There could have been different generals fighting over this, and it's really remarkable and a cool thing that civil war and strife did not erupt. So the reason we're starting off with 5 good emperors is because Nerva didn't have a son who he could just give to and say, here, let's see if my son can do a good job. He consciously picked someone who had already proven themselves. That's the key, right? Think about Nero becoming emperor at 16. He hadn't proven himself. He had never led soldiers. He had never accomplished anything. But Trajan is a grown man. He's well respected. He had done things. We already know he's capable. So that's the key of why Trajan is set up for success, because he already has accomplished things in his life. So I'm very excited to talk to you about the 5 good emperors, because this is kind of a positive period in Roman history, and Trajan is one of the more famous, well-known emperors. So I'm going to stop here, though, and deal with the next few emperors next time, because Nerva was kind of short, but Trajan's reign is much longer, and there's a lot more to talk about there. So we'll pick up with the second of the 5 good emperors, Trajan, next time. Okay? Hope you guys are having a very good day. Pop by my office hours if you need to see me about anything from chapters 9 or 10, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk to you about Trajan. Valete.